This evening's program is brought to you in collaboration between Armed Forces Thanksgiving, the Gerald R. Ford Foundation, and the National Archives and Records Administration. For those friends of Ford and supporters of Armed Forces Thanksgiving in the room, I thank you very much. This program is due to your ongoing support of these very important and foundations. It is with your support that make public programs like this possible. I would also like to thank those from the Grand Rapids Home for Veterans who are here this evening, as well as all veterans here in the room. I would also like to ask any World War II veterans in the room to please either stand or raise your hand. Thank you very much. We appreciate your service. To talk about the mission of Armed Forces Thanksgiving, I would like to introduce you to Denny Gillum, who is a board member of Armed Forces Thanksgiving. Denny?
Thank you, Joel. I am Denny Gillum. I'm a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel, and I am on the board of Armed Forces Thanksgiving. Armed Forces Thanksgiving, the concept of Armed Forces Thanksgiving is we invite high school kids to sit at a table with veterans and some business people who appreciate veterans. And while there's a presentation and good speakers and all that sort of stuff, the whole concept is to help these high school kids understand our military. It's not a recruiting thing. We won't let recruiters in the door. Literally, we won't. It's not recruiting. What it is, it's an orientation. Too many of our youth today don't have a clue about the military, and they don't have a clue about the fact that skills learned in the military are transferable to industry and that employers like to hire them. That's why we have employers, students, and veterans at a table. And the concept is they talk. We coordinate all across West Michigan. We have high schools there. I think we have 60-something tables full of 4 students, 4 businessmen or women, and 2 veterans at all these tables. We still have room for a few more. If you're interested at all in this, just Google Armed Forces Thanksgiving. It'll come right up. There's a lot of information. If you would like to attend, we're still looking for a few veterans to join the table. You don't have to be any of those. You can come there are just blank seats. So 1, would you help us tell people about it? 2, if you're interested, participate. If you want more information, Armed Forces Thanksgiving, just Google it. Thank you very much.
So on to tonight's program. James Hornfischer's books have led reviewers to rate him as one of the most commanding naval historians writing today. In fact, all of his books have been selections of the Chief of Naval Operations professional reading program managed by the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations in the U.S. Naval War College. He is a regular contributor for the Wall Street Journal and has written for the Smithsonian, Naval History, Naval Institute Proceedings, and other periodicals. He has lectured at the U.S. Naval Academy, the Marine Corps University at Quantico, the National World War II Museum, the National Museum of the Pacific War, and other venues. He also serves on the board of the Naval Historical Foundation. His book, The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors, a combat narrative about the Battle off Samar, won the Samuel Eliot Morrison Award and was chosen by Wall Street Journal as one of the 5 best books on war as soldiers know it, and by the Naval History magazine as one of a dozen Navy classics. How much of a classic is it? Well, let me tell you, I have a private story about this. As many of you know, I used to be the archivist of the U.S. Navy, but before that, I worked at the Pentagon for 3 years for the Secretary of the Navy and in the Chief of Naval Operations area. Admiral Richardson, who was the brand new Chief of Naval Operations at the time, literally it was the 2nd or 3rd day on the job, and I had the honor to brief Admiral Richardson about information management, records, and declassification. And as I'm briefing Admiral Richardson, who is kind of moving into the office. Lo and behold, on the table next to me is a copy of Samar. So you know you've made it when you have the book sitting on the Chief of Naval Operations desk, and you are regarded as a must-read at the Naval Academy for their history classes. Now, why Samar has not been turned into a movie yet, I have no idea. James is a native of Massachusetts, currently resides in Austin, Texas. He is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Colgate University and holds a degree from the University of Texas School of Law. And hope you are all as excited about this lecture as I am. Again, thank you very much to our sponsors, the Ford Foundation and Armed Forces Thanksgiving. Ladies and gentlemen, James Hornfischer.
Let's see, is the lavalier working? Can you hear me? Well, in that case, I just turned it off. No, there we go. Very good. Well, thank you, Joel. Joel Westfall has been a great ally for my emerging work into the early Cold War. A couple of years ago, when I was at Naval Historical Foundation at the History and Heritage Command as well, to do some archival research, he was helping me navigate those wickets and warrens, and that's a constant challenge to deal in the period of classified documents. Because those of us who are writing World War II are utterly spoiled by the availability of everything you ever might want. By a very helpful, knowledgeable archivist. And so in the course of writing these 4 books on World War II, on the Navy and World War II, I've had great support from archival professionals such as Joel and other really dedicated servants of scholarship. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. I guess in April, people in Michigan emerge from hibernation. In April in Texas, we are getting ready to go into hibernation because of what's looming immediately ahead. And the drought years have been Austin long enough to have seen some droughts, and just the vision of a flowing river through the middle of your town is just a wonderful thing. Before I get started, I thought I should say how my accidental career as a naval historian came about, just briefly, because whenever I'm in the presence of people who have served in the uniform, including World War II veterans, we have 2 here tonight, at least 2, I want to start with a disclaimer that I've never worn the uniform. I've been motivated to undertake the research I've undertaken and to write the books I've written because I've had a lifelong fascination with World War II, with the Navy in particular, and with the fascinatingly complex, involved, and weighty operations that were conducted in the Pacific, in particular, from 1941 to 1945. Earlier in my career, when I was a 10-year-old, I built model aircraft. I played Avalon Hill war games. I watched Black Sheep Squadron on NBC every Thursday night for 3 wonderful years. These ridiculous plots involving Japanese paratroopers capturing General MacArthur and Pappy Boynton and the Black Sheep rallying to save the great general. But nonetheless, all of it was redeemed by the opportunity to see real live F-4U Corsairs peeling off, to attack, American trainer aircraft masquerading as Japanese fighters. But fantastic preparation for what fuels my writing, which is just a kind of a base level interest that, boy, was this history important, and the challenges daunting, the sacrifices great, and the hardware really, really cool. So eventually you grow out of that into deeper appreciation of history. And as I, didn't start out as a writer, I started out as a book publishing operative. And so I have this parallel life now where people who come hear me talk about my books don't know about my day job. And the people who I know through my day job don't know about my moonlighting as a naval historian. So this slide will give you a sense of where I come from. As a book publishing operative, I've been involved with a lot of military history over the years as a literary agent. So I've represented servicemen on memoirs, Medal of Honor recipients like Jack Lucas, and worked with Marcus Luttrell, who you probably know as the lone survivor, Dusty Cleese, the great SBD dive bomber pilot of the Battle of Midway, published a memoir last year posthumously that I was involved with. And so my writing has been an outgrowth of this interest which has really been with my whole life. And the books didn't start getting written until I had dinner with a publishing colleague of mine back in 2000, 2001. And I got talking about the battle off Samar, as Joel alluded to. If you give me a couple of gin and tonics and get me talking about the USS Samuel B. Roberts and the USS Hull, I'm going to get a little bit emotional. And so so Tracy Devine, my old publishing colleague, we worked together at HarperCollins for a number of years, just kind of heard me, took in the story, then looked at me and said, and I kind of said, gee, who can we get to do this? It's such a great story. And she said the obvious thing, well, maybe you should write that book. And it took me another year to get the hint before I wrote the proposal, and then, by God, they called my bluff and said, okay, here's a contract, go write this book. And so after 87 to 2000, about 13 years into my career, I've been pitching books long enough, writing jacket copy. Now I had to go figure out how to write one. And so what do you lean on then? If you haven't served in a uniform, you've never seen the sights, you've never lived the culture, you've never earned a commission, and never put your own hide on the line, how then do you write a book that is going to end up on the Chief of Naval Operations desk? And it goes back to the 10-year-old Hornfischer kid who was playing war games and watching bad history on NBC on Thursday nights. It was about passion, and it was about storytelling. These aren't technical books. They're meant to get the technical things right, but at bottom they're about storytelling. I like the rubric that the great David McCullough said, where when he put it this way. He said, if I tell you that the Queen died and the King died, I've given you a couple of facts. But if I told you that the Queen died and the King died of a broken heart, I've given you a story. And so what I've tried to do in these books is to capture the story of these signature moments. And the books kind of trace a steepening arc of ambition, if you will. The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors is a battle history. 75% of that book takes place in a 30-minute or in a 2-hour time span. It's a surface engagement, the most epic surface engagement waged by really the greatest upset victory, I think, ever in naval history. And the book did well enough for the publisher says, well, what's next? And so Ship of Ghosts was a story I really hadn't had any exposure to, the story of the USS Houston. I was not alone. Most Americans never heard of the story of the Houston. She was sunk early in the war, and her surviving crew endured 3.5 years in Japanese captivity. And it's a uniquely horrible story, again, badly memorialized by Hollywood and the bridge in the River Kwai, which gets some really essential things exactly backwards about what being a prisoner of the Japanese was like. It's a pretty good movie as a movie goes, but the history behind it was twisted significantly. And Ship of Ghosts is an attempt to take you inside the story of that ship's company as they navigate that particularly unique circle of hell in Burma and Thailand for the duration of the war. So the next two books are campaign books, Neptune's Infernos about Guadalcanal, and then Fleet at Flood Tide, which I'm going to dive into tonight, began life as a campaign narrative focused on the seizure of the Marianas Islands in the Central Pacific. And I realized then that you could really tell the story of the whole endgame of the Pacific War and the beginning of the Cold War by telling that story. Because in the Marianas Islands, for the first time, a number of things converged. And the title of the lecture, I revised it from the original pitch, Total War 1944-45, is what I'm going to talk about. But Revelation and Reckoning does a better job of capturing what the Marianas campaign was all about. America had its eyes opened by what happened on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in 1944. And what we saw there had consequences that would reverberate through the ensuing decades. And so we're going to get into this by showing you a map. All good military history starts with a map. And fortunately, we've been provided with a screen large enough where it's somewhat better than an eye chart. I apologize in the back of the room if some of the type is remote, but we can hit the highlights by pointing out the center of the map. You can see the landscape we're talking about. These are the Marianas Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. In June 1944, at the very same moment the D-Day landings are taking place over in Europe, this is really the week after the Normandy landings, America stages an even more remarkable feat of arms, launching 3 divisions of soldiers from one island, Eniwetok in the Marshall Islands was the staging area for this operation, 1,000 miles to the west across open ocean, haunted by Japanese submarines, And these 3 divisions of American soldiers go ashore outnumbered. 3 divisions. It's the first time we've attacked an objective of that size, with that large a force, and been outnumbered by the enemy garrison. This is not the way they teach it at the War College. You're supposed to go in with a 3-to-1 advantage. Well, we had some things going for us, so they tried it this way. So the campaign for the Marianas is the focus of the fleet at flood tide, because it crystallizes, for me, a number of facets of the war that are each fascinating in its own right. One is amphibious warfare, embodied by the Amtrak at top left. One is naval air power. The image from the cover of the book is an F-6F Hellcat, USS Lexington, 1944. We have Marines moving inland on Guam at lower left, and then we have a big head-on view of a B-29 superfortress, which represents the ultimate employment of these islands, which became very important air bases in the Central Pacific from which to bomb Japan and ultimately to force Japan to its knees by atomic attack. So how does it come that America, a liberal democracy, a nation informed by the Enlightenment, decides to wage war on this scale, targeting civilian populations for destruction by a weapon such as this, which is the little boy atomic bomb, August 6, 1945? What kind of circumstances would push us to that kind of an act? By what nature of enemy would we have to face where this becomes the only choice or the best choice? It did become the best choice, and both bombs were necessary to end the war early, to save lives. And we can make that argument, and we can discuss that case later in the Q&A if you like. I think it's interesting about, given the mess that was produced in the Pacific for these 4 years, what was the moral way to end it if the enemy was not going to give up of his own accord, which by any sense of logic he ought to have done in the summer of '44. What was going on, and why did this bomb become necessary? Well, the story begins with people, and the 3 people who are sort of the focal point of my narrative: Admiral Raymond Spruance, Admiral Kelly Turner, and Colonel Paul Tibbets. Spruance is sort of the Beatles to Admiral Halsey's Rolling Stones. Most people fall on one side or the other when it comes to admiring, people aren't equally fans of both, okay? Halsey was the face of the Navy. He was profane, he was aggressive, he was given to saying things like, we'll be happy to share the ocean with the Japs, we'll take the top half and we'll give them the bottom. And he said far worse than that when it came to political incorrectness. And so as a result, he was the public face of the war effort. He and Jimmy Doolittle, I suppose. Raymond Spruance was the more reserved, more taciturn, more intellectually oriented leader. He saw war as a puzzle. He'd frequently tell his wife, Margaret, that this is an interesting war. And she'd say, well, how can you find war interesting? He'd say, I don't know, it just is. Because to him it was about brain power. And so his whole routine was based around marching at high speed around his ships when he was at sea in order to keep the blood flowing, in order to support that big brain of his. He literally saw exercise as tuning up tuning up the body to support the brain so that he could puzzle out the problems of the war, the strategic architecture of it, the uses of time and space. He was very, some people actually saw him as lazy because he'd turn in at 5 o'clock and he'd go to sleep. Big problems were looming, and he worked a normal schedule. And some of his staff, he drove his staff crazy. They thought he was lazy, and that he had this big view of things. In that sense, he was much like his mentor Chester Nimitz. In that sense, Chester Nimitz is a brilliant, unsung American hero who is worth any study you have time to give him. Spruance was really Nimitz's most direct protege in the war. And so Halsey and Spruance basically took command of the principal combat fleet on a kind of a tag team basis. When Spruance was in charge, it was called the 5th Fleet. When Halsey had the fleet, it was the 3rd Fleet. They were the same ships, and this really confused the heck out of the Japanese. But really, we had one group of ships, we had one massive carrier task force, and they took turns running it. It was no coincidence, I think, that when the operation was challenging and dicey and involved and complex, it was Spruance's turn to take the fleet. And so we'll see this as we roll along. Spruance gets the job of taking the Marianas, and his principal right hand in this task Well, he has two of them. Mark Mitscher, who's not pictured here, Mark Mitscher had the carriers as commander of Task Force 58. 15 aircraft carriers, I'll get into that in a moment. But pictured here is Kelly Turner, and Kelly Turner has pride of place over Mitscher, first because of rank, I guess, but Kelly Turner, as commander of Spruance's amphibious force, was really where the rubber hit the road in terms of our ability to project power over open ocean and take an objective like Saipan in the Marianas Islands. Admiral King called amphibious heavy lift the outstanding feature of the war. Up until June 44, we've been taking these little curly cues of coral defended by a regiment at most, by a Japanese regiment. We'd go in with two regiments and rout them and take some losses, and this would be Tarawa, and it would be, Kwajalein and places like that. But at Saipan, we have a much larger objective. We have 30,000 Japanese defenders, as well as some other complicating factors, and we've got to have the ability to carry the fleet across the sea. And this was Turner's business. He was profane, he was irascible, he was volatile, he was an alcoholic. But he had brain wattage, at least the match of Spruance, when it came to managing the intricacies of an amphibious landing, which indeed is very complex. Managing the waves as they go ashore, the timing of it all, the sequencing, the arrangement, the storage, the stowage, what order do you load things, then you have to do it in reverse when you get to the line of departure, and so forth. This was his business, and it was a very critical business to master. I'm not sure we have it today, certainly not on that scale. But Turner was the man. Now, Paul Tibbets was the reason for the season. He was the commander of the first atomic strike group that ever existed in the history of the universe. The 509th Composite Group, the specially outfitted B-29s, his sole mission was to train to drop the atomic bomb, and it was a very special and unique mission, very distinct from what the ordinary B-29 drivers were asked to do. High-level bombing, or low-level bombing for that matter, with conventional weapons was a very straight arrow affair. With the atomic bomb, Tibbets basically trained his men to fly a 4-engine B-29 bomber like an SBD Dauntless. I mean, they would drop the bomb and go into this diving turn to escape the blast and get turned all the way around and point their thin cross-section to the explosion so their own aircraft wouldn't get knocked out of the sky. Nobody knew what they were doing in that secret corner of Tinian, certainly not the other aviators. There was some jealousy. What's going on with that special unit? Oh yeah, they're going to win the war, right? Ha, ha, ha. And the ordinary guys would fly over Tokyo and get shot down in great numbers. And Tibbets was working on a secret project in this fenced-off corner of Tinian. Anyway, Tibbets is a great story. He's another anchoring character in the book because he represents strategic air power combined with the science of Los Alamos. His job was to weaponize and deploy and use the bomb. Now, the title of the book, I need to show this slide at least briefly, not so you can memorize the numbers, but so you can register just one small thing. And that has to do with the size of these numbers relative to the size of the silhouette of the ship. Aircraft carrier construction, this is U.S. naval production by type. We built a handful of large aircraft carriers over the course of the war, measured in, we have a pretty good double digit, 43, but generally single digit, same with battleships, large cruisers of the Alaska Guam class, heavy cruisers. These are the ships the Navy defines itself by, these beautiful combatants with the big guns. But the fleet at flood tide is best encapsulated by the number at lower right here. We're talking 4- and 5-figure numbers representing the number of landing craft turned out at shipyards, much lesser known than Newport News or Portsmouth. We're talking about Higgins boats built by private industry in New Orleans. We're talking about cargo ships, built by the Kaiser Company on the West Coast. 9,400 of these ships were launched in 1942, 21,043, 37,000 in 1944, and these are the numbers that enable the fleet at flood tide, the heavy lift component that allows us to stage the Normandy invasion over an oceanic vista thousands of miles long. But before we can get there, the carriers have got to learn how to do their business in a way they've never done it before. In the Marianas, what is provoked is the greatest air-sea fight in history, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. And so what we now have, because of the production of aircraft carriers, we've got the capability to deploy them in great numbers. And aircraft carriers go from being ships that have to hit and run and kind of hide in the vast breadth of the sea to ships that can concentrate and hit and stay because there are so many of them. God help the Japanese who ever tried to attack them. This is what happens in the prelude to the Marianas landings when, for the first time, the U.S. Navy is tasked with hitting the Japanese Central Pacific base of Truk. It's a great dive destination. If you're a scuba diver, you might know Truk for all the wrecks that are there to be seen in these crystal clear lagoon waters. The reason those wrecks are there is what Admiral Spruance did with these carriers in February of 1944. He smashed Truk hard and opened the way to go to the Marianas. We just couldn't get to the Marianas on my big map. We really couldn't make this leap, this big long arrow from Eniwetok to Saipan without doing something about Truk right there. And so Spruance goes in there with 9 aircraft carriers in February of 1944. Operation Hailstone spends 2.5 days reducing Truk to rubble and sinking the Japanese Navy. Well, what's left of the Japanese Navy? The Japanese Navy had detected the reconnaissance of their big base and pulled their big ships out the week before we struck. But the point was to neutralize Truk, and that opens the gateway for the operation that's really the focal point of my lecture. The revelation and the reckoning will spring from Saipan and then from Tinian in the Marianas Islands. One critical thing about the map, there's a dotted line that runs north to south. Right here. This is taken from Japanese strategic planning maps. The dotted line represents Japan's national defense zone as of September of 1943. So the Japanese Imperial General Staff identified this as the boundary of their perimeter. And so what we have going into Saipan is the first penetration of that dotted line by U.S. forces. The character of the war changes when we cross that line. A Rubicon is crossed. We see things we hadn't seen before. We see a big island, we see a large garrison, and we see something else on Saipan that will make a major impression on our forces. We see tough terrain, and we see cities, there's city fighting, and we see Japanese civilians on a battlefield for the first time. The Marianas Islands Saipan had 25,000 Japanese traders, merchants located on it, living there, sending back sugar and copra and pineapple to the home islands. It was an important commercial node. It paid for a lot of the Japanese war industry, the trade that they're able to conduct between the Marianas and the home islands. The imperial network of trade was easily disrupted once the war started, and these people were kind of cut off. But there were still 25,000 of them there as the 2nd and 4th Marine Division hit the beach at Saipan on June 15th. What are these civilians going to do? Well, we build some stockades. We imagine they're going to surrender. We imagine they're going to bring their children in, and we're going to take care of them because this is what, we're not going to hurt the non-combatants. We're going to give them food and attend to them with medical care. This was our expectation. The reality was far different. The American attack on Saipan, the 3 divisions going ashore in the middle of June, provoked the Japanese Navy to its largest action of the war. The Japanese end up sending their entire aircraft carrier force to oppose the U.S. landings. They'd been holding them in reserve because they weren't sure where we were going to strike. And for those of you who've read on the Pacific War, you'll know that one of the problems that Nimitz had to deal with was this issue of divided command. You had MacArthur running the Southwest Pacific campaign, moving along New Guinea toward the Philippines, and then you had Nimitz and his boys in the Navy and the Marine Corps charging across the Central Pacific in line with their old Orange Plan drawn up at the Naval War College in the 20s. The long game-boarded, finally executing the long game-boarded problem of defeating this oceanic empire, Imperial Japan. Well, flip the script and imagine yourself facing this divided command. They say you're never supposed to have 2 commanders in a combat zone. You're supposed to have 1 guy in charge. The only thing worse than having divided command is facing it. The Japanese have no idea where we're going to strike. We could be striking toward the Philippines, we could be striking toward Formosa, now Taiwan. They really had to wait and see. Once they do see, once it's clear that we're moving heavily onto Saipan, they send the entirety of their aircraft carrier task force to oppose us. Japan's strategy had been to seek a decisive battle. Their planners talked about it all through the years about how they're going to lure the American battle fleet out and strike it down in a decisive battle. They've been conditioned by their success at Tsushima, the original kamikaze turning back the Mongol fleet, the Battle of Tsushima, another great victory over the Russians. And so in Japanese history, it had always been this sudden, massive stroke, this sword stroke that literally destroyed the enemy's ability to resist. And so they fancied that they would have their moment. And so Admiral Ozawa sorties from his bases in Celebes and in the East Indies and sends 9 aircraft carriers to oppose Spruance and Mitscher off of Saipan. There is a absolutely epic carrier battle that precedes. It's known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot. It is the culmination of U.S. naval air power coming to bear. The F-6F Hellcat fighter aircraft deployed in numbers large enough to support both defensive combat air patrols to protect the carriers from attack, while also engaging in strikes, so escorting our bombers and keeping them safe from attack. We finally have enough flat tops to perform both missions simultaneously. And the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, fought on June 19th, is the exhibition of the state-of-the-art. American pilots claimed 380 air-to-air kills in a single day, June 19th. And so the Marianas campaign would alone be significant were that the only consequence of it, this drawing out of the Japanese carriers, the great victory in the air-to-air engagement of June 19th. Spruance then has the opportunity, after the air battle, to go out and sink the Japanese carriers, and this is where some controversy comes his way, because the carrier commanders want to chase the Japanese fleet. Spruance knows his mission, as defined by Nimitz, is to cover and support the invasion of Saipan, to stand by and protect the beachhead. And so Spruance knows how to read an order. He knows what the words cover and support means. And so what that means is he attaches a leash around the collars of his carrier commanders, and he says, "Thou shalt not go west." He holds them in place. They're stuck in this defensive, protective mode, and they're denied the opportunity to go what every carrier commander wants to do, and that's go relive the glory of the Battle of Midway. Sink Japanese carriers. Spruance, it just wasn't fair. He was a black shoe. He was a surface Navy man. He commanded battleships. The Mississippi was his great defining command as a captain. And so he'd come of age in the battleship Navy. He wasn't even a carrier guy. He wasn't an aviator. So what's he doing winning the Battle of Midway? Why does Spruance get that honor? Now he's going to do this and win the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot as well, the greatest carrier battle in history? The carrier commanders couldn't stand it. Spruance wasn't one of them. He didn't understand the mobility factor. He didn't understand how the efficacy of carriers in this sort of hit and run mode. He's holding them on a leash, stay by the island, protect the grunts, and they'd never forgive him for it. But this was Spruance, and he wins a great victory with his naval air power in the Marianas. Sidebar, the USS Cavallo, a great museum ship down in Texas, pretty close to where the USS Lexington is to this day. We take our scouts down there. My boys were Cub Scouts. We've done 3 or 4 overnights in Lexington. And there's this little old submarine across the bay. Apparently they take scouts too, but they don't take very many because it's kind of a small little tube of steel in the sea. The Cavallo was able to get her sights into a Japanese aircraft carrier, Shokaku. The same day, Albacore takes down another carrier, the Taiho. It's one of the few examples we have of submarines supporting a major fleet operation kind of directly like this. And it all kind of happened by accident. These guys were out scouting and they stumbled across some prime targets. But we have U.S. submarines taking out 2 Japanese carriers. We've got the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot taking place. And then Spruance does get one opportunity to let his flyboys go attack some Japanese carriers. It's a fleeting opportunity seized at the, sort of late in the day as dusk is approaching. One thing about our naval aviators, they didn't fly after dark. So they weren't trained in landing at night. But this was a calculated risk. Nimitz's mantra was always determine, weigh your risks, operate by the principle of calculated risk. If the benefit you calculate exceeds your level of risk, do it. And so Mitscher confers with Spruance, and they make a late afternoon strike against the fleeing Japanese carriers. They've had their air wings torn apart in the Turkey Shoot, and Mitscher's boys get a hold of the Japanese carriers late in the day on the 20th, and they sink one and damage another one, but most of the Japanese carriers do get back to Japan. Again, the American carrier commanders do not forgive Spruance for depriving them of their reprise of the Battle of Midway. An incredibly dramatic affair called the Turn On the Lights Affair. These aircraft launched, as dusk is approaching, are coming home, low on fuel. Many of the pilots are wounded, and they have no idea where their carriers are, or they have a general idea by radio beacons, but they've got to find their carriers to land at night, in which they're not trained. And so they come in and sprint. Mark Mischer knows the pilots are out there. He can hear them on the radio. Some of them are breaking down in tears. They're exhausted. They're wounded. And he issues an order, turn on the lights, which is something ship skippers do not do in submarine-infested waters. If somebody flicks a match to light a cigarette at night on the sea, you can see it from 5 miles away or more. And so here comes the turn on the lights order. Every destroyer, every carrier turns on every carbon arc spotlight in the fleet. And the returning American pilots think they've stumbled upon a Japanese base, and they panic for a moment, and then they realize it's our own fleet helping us come home. And so again, the camaraderie, the esprit de corps of U.S. naval aviation is never higher than when Mischer takes care of his boys in this manner, risking his fleet to bring them home. And they bring home 75% of those planes. The rest of them ditch in the sea around the fleet and get picked up. Some of them try to land on destroyers, and that never works out very well. So here we have an aerial shot of the Japanese fleet taking it on the chin from our aviators. Meanwhile, back in Saipan, we're dealing with a problem as the two Marine divisions, the 4th Marine Division we land on the west coast of Saipan, 4th Marine Division cuts all the way across and moves north. The 2nd Division holds the coast, pivots, and it's like a swinging gate. They kind of do one of these. And along the way, we bring in a great many Japanese civilians, like this young Japanese boy here, the son of one of the merchant families, presumably, being tended to by a Marine. What we find, though, is that the Japanese civilians are by and large not surrendering. They're not coming in like we thought they would do. Some of them are being held forcibly by the Japanese army as they, kind of retreat up the island. Saipan is mountainous. It's got a 1,500-foot central peak. It's filled with coral and limestone and basaltic lava caves and little crevices everywhere. The terrain is just terrible to fight in. And so as the Marines move up the island, it's very slow going. They come upon a cave. They hear Japanese voices inside. They have an interpreter demand that the people come out, and usually nobody comes out. Well, your battalion commander has given you orders to move up island. You're going to leave these potential enemy in your rear area? I don't think so. The grenades come out, the flamethrowers come up, and they seal the cave. A lot of civilians are being held in there against their will by the Japanese army. The Japanese army is going to fight to the death, and they've brainwashed the civilians that to surrender to American forces is to expose themselves to all forms of torture and rape. They've told them that to become to receive your enlistment in the U.S. Marine Corps, you have to have killed your mother to prove how tough and brutal you are. And they've brainwashed the Japanese civilians on Saipan that American fighting forces are so bloodthirsty that the most unspeakable things will happen to you if you fall into their custody. And so what they do is they hide in their caves or flee up island is they come to these cliffs. This is the northern promontory of Saipan, known as Marpy Point. This is a picture taken just a few years ago by a drone, I guess. But these are the cliffs that Japanese mothers and children are standing on as American troops are closing in on them with bullhorns, speaking in Japanese, telling them to come in, we'll take care of you, we have medicine, we have food and water. And hundreds of people go over these cliffs, preferring that to being captured by the American Marines. This is witnessed by hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Americans, enlisted men, non-coms, officers, and it makes quite an impression on the day Admiral King, Admiral Nimitz, and the Corps Commander on Saipan, Howland Mad H.M. Smith, tour the island. These guys arrive before the island's even secure. So Saipan, the fight for Saipan is about 3 weeks underway when these guys come to tour battlefield conditions. They're escorted by a picked squad of Marine riflemen to keep the Japanese snipers at bay, and they tour the island. Can you imagine? We've got 5, 9, we've got like 12, 13 stars, a flag officer in this one Jeep. But what they see, they see the bodies drifting in the surf off Marpy Point, women and children. They hear reports from Marine commanders about how the Japanese are conducting this fight. Now, we've seen suicidal Japanese soldiers before, but we haven't seen their civilians. The level of terror, the brainwashing, the suicides, and it gets worse the farther American forces go west. This is the first taste in Saipan. It's the first objective inside the dotted line, the inner perimeter of the Japanese Empire. And so what happens is, after this little island tour, Nimitz goes back to Pearl Harbor. He's about to have a meeting with General MacArthur. They're coming in to meet with President Roosevelt. This meeting takes place at the end of July, shortly after the little circumnavigation of Saipan. And they talk Pacific War strategy. Where are we going from here? And this is the famous meeting where MacArthur kind of comes in all blustery and talks about his destiny to liberate the Philippine people, and we have to continue through the Southwest, and this should be the axis of advance. Give me the whole fleet, and we'll make short work of it. And Nimitz gently makes the point that, well, we've had this long prepared strategy to go across the Central Pacific, and we ought to continue that. FDR approves his political dexterity by authorizing both operations just continue just the way they were. And so he doesn't upset any apple carts. But what happens is, after that meeting, King, for his part, so we have the president with Nimitz and MacArthur in Hawaii. King, who's in the passenger seat here, returns to Quebec City, or goes to Quebec City, returns to Washington, then Quebec City, for the Octagon Conference. And the Octagon Conference is the third or fourth, or maybe fifth, meeting of the British and American high commands about worldwide war strategy. So these are very pivotal meetings that followed directly their experience of witnessing Japanese civilian resistance on Saipan, and we can see the effect on their thinking by the dispatches that follow these couple of meetings. Here's one from President Roosevelt to MacArthur, August 9th, 1944. Following the meeting in Hawaii, he sends MacArthur a handwritten note crediting his really magnificent job against great difficulties given us by climate and by certain human animals. This is evidence that the president was powerfully impressed by the reports of his commanders about what had happened on Saipan. We did not know humans were capable or subject to the type of brainwashing and suicide that was demonstrated on Saipan. And this is evidence that this language, that certain human animals, some people will say, well, was the Pacific War a race war? And I say, well, it was on one side. It wasn't on this side yet. It was the Japanese waged the Pacific War as a race war, explicitly, for 4 whole years. And American policy was generally in response to it. Now, I don't want to get into this spider hole right now, but things happen, people use racial epithets and so forth. But at the matter of policy and strategic direction, I would submit that it wasn't a race war on the American side. It was a race war on the Japanese side. Witness what they did in Nanking, et cetera, Philippines, any number of places. But here you see the stunning effect upon President, now this is a personal letter, maybe MacArthur was doing some locker room talk with one of his top generals here, but then how do you account for this one? This follows the Quebec City meeting, the Octagon meeting, the Brits and the Americans meet, and this is the official Allied press communique following those meetings, and it refers at the end of this statement about the decisions reached at this meeting about the war direction. It refers to the barbarians of the Pacific. How are we going to bring this enemy to heel? September 13th, 1944, the meeting, gets this report. September 16th, we go into Saipan, by the way, is secured in August. We invade Tinian next, and then Guam is sewn up sometime later, and the war moves westward. But the revelation still reverberates from the Marianas. Who is this enemy, and what is it going to take to defeat them? The fall of the Marianas Islands is the end of the Tojo government. So there were political forces within Japan who recognized that this is the end. We cannot beat the Americans. And some people have seized upon comments like that. You'll find them from advisors or mid-level generals or commanders, or some politicians who are somewhat below the station of the emperor and his war council, to say, well, yeah, we knew Japan knew they were beaten. Why didn't we just, offer them terms and tell them to surrender? Well, that was the point of the Potsdam Conference, and the terms eventually were offered. Unconditional surrender, what were the terms we were offering? And it's often said that Japan resisted unconditional surrender because they needed to retain their emperor. Well, they put other terms on it too. And if people tell you Japan was ready to surrender, ask them, what do you mean by Japan? What persons do you mean when you say Japan was ready to surrender? That needs some close inquiry, and that's what I've tried to do at the end of this book. So the plan is, the way we're going to have to do this thing is we're going to have to invade the home islands. We're going to stage in the Philippines, we're going to stage in the Marianas, And the first stage, Operation Olympic, would commence November 1st, 1945, with 14 divisions of the 6th Army going in from the Philippines. March 1st, 1946 would be the second blow. I said 1946, right? The war ends somewhat short of that. 1946, the plan, Operation Cornet, was the seizure of the Tokyo plains, Honshu, involving an even larger number of divisions of the 8th Army. And this is the plan. We're going to support this operation and pave the way for it by beginning the strategic bombardment of Japan. The airfields of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam will be the staging area for this strategic aerial assault. And here you have a picture of one of our true strategic advantages in the war, and that was the ability of the Seabees and Army aviation engineers to transform a lousy little island into a world-class aviation complex with bulldozers and steel matting, and they could work really, really fast. In fact, this conversion was beginning before Saipan was even secure. There were infantry engagements over the emerging improving airfield project on the south part of Saipan in July. But these guys work under gunfire. They work day and night. And the transformation of the 3 islands is finally complete. And by Thanksgiving of 1944, the first strikes against the home islands are airborne from the Marianas. This is a picture of the Tokyo fire raid, March 9-10, 1945. The battle for Iwo Jima is on. The rationale for taking Iwo Jima was to neutralize it as a fighter base for Japanese fighters attacking our bombers as they fly north. And so the incendiary attack was settled upon as the best way to bomb Japan. This was a pre-war insight, actually. Our visiting military officers would notice that these cities were made of wood. We noticed this about some German cities too, so it wasn't just limited to Japan, but we noticed that incendiary bombing could be a very effective way of bringing an enemy to heel. And so the initial plan to bomb from high altitude using precision tactics went south when we realized that Japanese the wind patterns over Japan, we're talking 100-mile-an-hour winds at high altitude, blowing bombs way off course. And so the plan was to go at low altitude. And these cities burned night after night after night. If you run down the list, there's an incredible documentary featuring Robert McNamara, the eventual Secretary of Defense. He was working for the 20th Air Force in the Marianas as a statistical control officer, and his job was to count sortie rates and measure the tonnage of bombs dropped to make sure the trains were moving on schedule, so to speak. And he talks about how the losses, first of all, the losses in U.S. air crews, and also the stunningly imperceptible effect on Japanese war morale of these bombings. The emperor is taking in this unfolding disaster, and as he meets with his cabinet, even after the fall of Tojo's regime, you'd think some sense would come to the Japanese war leadership, and this does not happen. What we had in the case of Tojo falling was basically a fanatical militarist being replaced by a waffler. And so Prime Minister Koiso really can't manage the split of opinion on the War Council, which is 6 men, the so-called big. These are the opinions who will determine whether Japan surrenders. The Big Six have the policy-making authority to make such decisions under the authority of the emperor, who kind of floats above them in this detached way. Hirohito does not deign to make speeches at policy meetings or even make decisions. It is said, tradition holds that the emperor, as a semi-divine being, float above such considerations. And so we have the problem of this Big Six unable to decide what to do. And so Tokyo burns, and Yokohama burns, and Kobe burns, and all these Japanese cities. The stunning thing from the McNamara documentary is he shows some documents. Army Air Force's documents explicitly compare the Japanese cities that were targeted by population to American counterpart cities of equal population. And so it puts you through the imaginative exercise of envisioning Cleveland and Detroit and Los Angeles and Boston. What would that do to us if these cities were burning? In the case of Tokyo, 2/3 of the industrial area was wiped out. And the fact is that the Japanese continue their war effort, and it hardly registers on them. They're focused on winning the next big island battle, which by now is at Okinawa. April to June of 1945. Okinawa is really the last frontier before we're looking at landing in Japan. Okinawa is going to be the staging area. Okinawa is really Japanese territory, although the Okinawans wouldn't probably put it that way. They're treated very badly by the Japanese. And what our troops witnessed on Okinawa is an order of magnitude worse than what we saw even on Saipan. We are inferring what our casualty rates are going to be based on the losses we're taking on in previous islands. So Saipan was the basis of the calculation for a time. And then Okinawa, it was even worse. We're trying to figure out how many men we're going to lose taking Japan. This is compounded by the fact that really the worst thing that happens to our war effort is when Hitler throws in the towel. And I'll get to that in a moment. I think I have a slide on that. But VE Day will not be good news for our Pacific commanders. Very kind of runs against what you might expect, doesn't it? Anyway, the reason the Japanese aren't able to surrender is we have guys like this on the Big Six. General Korochika Anami, the Supreme War Direction Council, he and his 5 colleagues hold divergent views, but Anami's voice is very loud indeed. And he and his colleagues believe that, the great decisive battle is just within reach if only we commit ourselves to it. And if we fail, isn't it the natural fate of the Japanese people, all of them to die? These were the views of General Anami, his colleague General Umezu, and Admiral Toyota, the former commander-in-chief of the Japanese fleet. Those 3 held what you can only call sort of a bitter-end view of what Japanese war policy should be. We will not negotiate, but if we do negotiate, we're not going to allow war crimes tribunals, there won't be an occupation. So these conversations are happening too. Well, if we did accept Potsdam terms, what would our conditions be? And they'd say, keep the emperor, yes, but we'll not allow an occupation, we'll not allow war crimes tribunals, and we won't allow demilitarization or disarmament. So these are complete non-starters, and this is as far as we ever get. How do Americans know these are the Japanese views? Because we're reading their mail. We've broken their codes. We're reading all of this. We're intercepting through ultra intercepts of Japanese military communications and the so-called magic intercepts of their diplomatic traffic. We know in detail about the discord within the Japanese government. They aren't surrendering anytime soon. So among the efforts we undertake here is to flood Japan with propaganda leaflets that look like this. Our carrier aircraft, our bombers are usually carrying explosive ordnance, but a great many missions, they'd be dropping leaflets, trying to tell the Japanese people that to follow this emperor was to march into death. It was a massive effort. The idea that we were looking to just kill Japanese wantonly is belied by the fact that we're desperately trying to get this war to end through persuasive methods and then failing that through the use of a terrible, terrible weapon. I mentioned VE Day. We have, as we contemplate invading Japan, we have 3 problems. We have a personnel problem, we have a political problem, and we have an intelligence problem. The political problem is that after Hitler throws in the towel, this is simplifying things a bit, but it's not inaccurate to say, that America's mothers say, damn it, bring my boys home. This becomes a political problem for President Truman. How many campaigns do they have to go through? North Africa, Sicily, Italy, southern France, Germany, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Tinian, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. When does this ever end? Bring my damn boys home. And so Truman is a politician, and he's aware that an election will be coming. FDR passes in April. Truman has the helm. The untested senator from Missouri confers with his Army Chief of Staff, George Marshall, and they come up with a point system to determine who gets to come home. And it's basically number of campaigns, number of months in service, war wounds, and they come up with a point system. You earn points, and if you pass a threshold, you go home. So what are our problems looking at invading Japan? Well, we're bringing home forces. On one level, until you know about the point system and this political problem, you think, oh, we're bringing the whole 8th Air Force from England to Okinawa. We're bringing all these Army divisions over to stage them in the Philippines to prepare to land. What prayer does Japan ever have? Well, that's not the way it worked out, really, because under the point system, all these units are threadbare. All their veterans are going home. And what are we going to invade Japan with? The order of battle looks pretty good until you allow for the point system discharges, and then you realize, gee, we thought we had 12,000 guys in this division, and now we have 10, and 2/3 of them are going to be, new recruits. So we have a personnel problem, which arises from the political problem, and then we have an intelligence problem. General MacArthur is trying to assess Japanese strength in the home islands, and his estimates are constantly being proven low. Number of Japanese divisions available in Kyushu, number of kamikaze aircraft available, for use against the fleet. There's intelligence to suggest that Japan is getting wise. They're no longer going to send their kamikazes after carriers and cruisers and battleships. They're going to target the transport shipping. And they're going to be landing kamikazes in the heads of our soldiers when they're at sea. And so the casualty estimates are going up, up, up. The timetable is being pushed backward to allow for, gathering of more resources, preparatory to the invasion of Kyushu in November of 45, when Colonel Tibbets returns into the picture. July, in the New Mexico desert, the Crossroads test, the Trinity test proves that the Fat Man type device can work. Our scientists figured Little Boy would work. It was a simple, the mechanism involved shooting one piece of uranium into another with a conventional explosion. The Fat Man involved this whole complex implosion device involving like 64 charges that have to be detonated simultaneously so that they crush a plutonium core. And this was proven up finally in July of 1945, that Fat Man will work. Once it's proven Fat Man will work, the Manhattan Project goes to war. Truman is in Potsdam. He's actually crossing the Atlantic when he gets word that the Hiroshima bomb was deployed and used. The orders for the mission had been written up by the Strategic Air Forces. They'd been given to the head of the War Department, Stimson, signed off on by Stimson with Truman's blessing. But you'll have to look awfully hard to find any kind of written order from Truman to bomb Japan with an atomic weapon. And in his memoirs, and I think it was in the memoirs of Groves, General Groves, the military head of the Manhattan Project, he said, this whole project has had kind of a momentum of its own. But what was carrying the momentum? I don't think this was the military-industrial complex run amok necessarily. I think what it was we are beside ourselves with desperation to end this war. The invasion might not work. If the Navy's preferred method, the Navy didn't want to invade. King and Nimitz didn't want any part of an invasion. They said, hold the blockade. The submarines are choking Japan to death. We've got them. This is working. This will work. Hold the blockade. Let them starve. Let them suffer famine. Let them burn from the air. Sure, let's bombard and blockade, but let's not invade. Anyway, again, Army, Navy, always at each other's throats over strategy. Which strategy is morally preferable? If you're in Truman's shoes here, what's the American way to end this war? How do we, and what's Truman's responsibility? What's his duty? Whose lives does the U.S. president have to look after? Lives of what nationality? The question answers itself. He's the commander-in-chief of the U.S. forces. So we're trying to calculate what our losses are going to be. But it's mindful also, as you look at the decision to drop the bomb, what are Japanese losses going to be under the different scenarios? Let's say we invade in November. Let's say that doesn't go well. Let's say we have to put a second wave in. Let's say we start using atomic bombs in tactical support of the invasion, which actually was the plan. Once you get into November of 45. We did end up using 2 bombs on Japan. Los Alamos was producing 1 a month. So by November, we'd have 3 more. The documents show these bombs would have been used in tactical support of Marine divisions, the Marine divisions forming up outside of, say, Kobe. So they're going to bomb the Japanese troop concentrations with the Fat Man devices and then send the Marines in. How's that going to look? How many Japanese, okay, let's say we didn't invade, and let's say we do the Navy thing, blockade and bombardment. How many Japanese are going to die under that strategy? The famine seizes hold. They're incredibly, humans are incredibly resourceful in extremis. We can survive on nothing when we have to, and the Japanese showed this. The national discipline that was, demonstrated in carrying out the Emperor's quixotic war plan is stunning. But even the Japanese were on the verge of famine. How many die under that scenario of blockade? How many Asians die as the Kwantung Army continues its rampages all across China and Manchuria? Every month the war, I think the calculus was 20,000 ordinary Asians, non-combatant Asians a month were dying in mainland Asia. So there's an argument, there's a moral argument for the fact that the atomic bomb was an act of mercy to end this thing as quickly as possible. And this is the rationale that finally moves Hirohito to act. The bomb goes off on August 6th over Hiroshima. Tibbets himself flies the Enola Gay, dropping the device. We have a Navy weaponeer tending to the bomb along the way. The Navy contribution, Deke Parsons was taking care of the bomb. His job was to fly it to the arm it in flight, deploy it, and Enola Gay, the Hiroshima mission, was a milk run, as the bomber pilots call it, over and back, right on schedule, just like Tibbets like things. 3 days later, the boxcar brings the plutonium device, the Fat Man, to Nagasaki. Nagasaki being the secondary target. Kokura was obscured by clouds. There were problems rendezvousing, there were all kinds of weather problems, and Major Chuck Sweeney finally settles on Nagasaki. He drops by radar, can't see the target, and anyway, he barely gets his crew back to Okinawa, Iwo Jima. But both bombs have a decisive effect on the war. They have a decisive effect, not in military terms. Any military analyst recognized Japan was beaten as early as the summer of '44 with the loss of the Marianas and the submarine campaign, choking off their logistical connections to the Philippines and to the Dutch East Indies. But wars don't end when a force is militarily beaten. Wars only end when the losing side acknowledges that he's been defeated. Defeat, then, the victory in war is a psychological condition. You can destroy their whole army, sink their whole navy, destroy their whole air force, and they can still fight. It's like that scene in Monty Python with the knights, right? What are you going to do, bleed on me? As he hacks off all the limbs. This is sort of what we're doing to Japan. And Hirohito acknowledges the primacy of the atomic bombs as the decisive factor in the war when he finally presides over his War Direction Council meeting and is actually, I guess the records say he was invited to speak by the Prime Minister, invited to share his view in the face of this continuing deadlock in the so-called Big Six, the Japanese War Direction Council. Hirohito on August 10th was invited to share his view with his colleagues. And he gives it an oration to his group in which he bursts into tears by all direct accounts of it, talking about the cruelty of the war and how the bomb, there's really no choice but to surrender in the face of this bomb. And the imperial rescript is the word for the official pronouncement of the emperor, which goes out over every Japanese radio station on August 14th announcing his decision to surrender, refers to the bomb specifically. Now, I see these books. There was a book this thick published a few years ago called Hiroshima, Nagasaki by an Australian journalist. And he says, the whole book is written from the premise that the bombs, bombing of civilian populations and the atomic bombs in particular were moral atrocities ipso facto, and there can be no justification for their use. And moreover, there is no evidence that the bombs had any effect on the Japanese decision to surrender. Then I read that and I put the book back on the shelf and I said, that's funny, because I just read the Japanese imperial rescript of August 14th and he specifically cites the bomb to millions of people over the radio the next day. So I guess the bomb was kind of important, and whether it moved him genuinely or whether it was a fig leaf for Japanese pride and dignity, it was the rationale that Hirohito seized upon on August 14th, 1945 to justify, to prepare his people for the reality that had been upon them for more than a year, that this war was over and we got to quit. So there's an incredible series, an incredible drama swallows Japan during this time when General Anami, whose wonderful picture I showed you earlier, stages a coup at the Imperial Palace. The guards put it down. There's loss of life on both sides. The coup fails. General Anami does the honorable thing with the blade and takes his own life. U.S. intelligence gets word that General Hideki Tojo his residence has been located. and we send a patrol to take his arrest, and he puts a bullet in his own gut. But he doesn't succeed in killing himself. It's left to, he's kept alive by transfusions of whole blood from U.S. Army GIs who are on that intelligence patrol, and they save Tojo's life so that he can be tried and executed. This is all following the surrender ceremony on September 2nd. And so we finally have Japan doing the right thing. The Imperial Conference, the tearful oration by Hirohito, the Imperial Rescript, the implementation of surrender. Here's a picture of Tojo after attempting suicide. He was quite impetuous. And so now, here's our invasion plan. The pivot. The switch is thrown by the Imperial broadcast on August 14th. We're surrendering. And the mission of conquest becomes a mission of mercy. The invasion forces become liberation forces. Operation Downfall is stricken from the books. It's not executed. Operation Magic Carpet is executed in its place. And the very same naval forces that were going to be used to bring the conquering armies to vanquish Japan the hard way are used instead to bring home American servicemen, and then also, indeed, Japanese servicemen from their far-flung garrisons across the Pacific. They've got millions of men still in Korea, in Manchuria. We bring as many of them home as we can as well. And so this Operation Magic Carpet eventually tends to all the combatants in the Pacific using U.S. naval heavy lift. Admiral King's The Great Development of the War is used to return the people whence they came. And the stunning reversal of psychology within the Japanese people themselves. I ask you to imagine that you are in the 11th Airborne Division, the first group of U.S. soldiers to touch foot on Japanese soil. You're flying in, well, you're not even a paratrooper, you're a radio technician. And these guys were flown in on C-54 cargo planes to land in Atsugi, Japan, a big air base south of Tokyo. Atsugi happens to be the principal training ground for the Japanese Kamikaze Air Corps. And you're a radio technician, and you're flying, and you're landing on their airfield. How are you liking that day? And they send you in because your job is to set up the radio communications to Okinawa so we can facilitate communications. You're the first Americans into Japan, and you're not even a soldier. You're a radio technician. Well, they're greeted, there's a lawn party. The Japanese come up, the mayor of Atsugi is there in his top hat and tails, and they're greeted with utmost courtesy. And this is the phenomenon that we witnessed all through the occupation. And MacArthur, to his credit, this is General MacArthur at his finest. For only a man with his lack of humility would have the ability to presume to place an emperor under him and use him as a by, with, and through. We talk, special forces today operate by, with, and through indigenous forces. We don't shoot people. We talk to the locals and deal with them and win their good graces and get them to shoot people. Well, in this case, we're getting the emperor to do our bidding of getting the Japanese to surrender peacefully. And we have our terms and conditions. We do all kinds of things to ensure that we turn over their ships and their airplanes and they spike their guns and everything. But what we're depending on mostly is for the Japanese people not to start a guerrilla war against our occupation forces as they move in. And they don't. More than that, they could not be more cooperative. They could not be nicer. And some of the accounts I read of it, our guys were a little bit chilled by it. It's like last month, you were going to stick a knife in your belly after we beat you, or you were going to do unspeakable things to us in combat, and your civilians are going to fight and take their own lives. And now it's all just hunky-dory because the emperor told you to surrender, and that switch was thrown, and the current just stopped flowing, and it was another world. And in a short couple of years, Japan will be one of the most important strategic allies the U.S. has ever had. Because we're a forward base against the expansion of communism in Asia. The predicate for the U.S. position, the U.S. strategic position in the Cold War in Asia, was based on how MacArthur treated the Japanese people. And he put the word down to the lowest level, about how they should operate. He actually reinstituted the brothels to keep his men happy and keep, so amazing things were done during this occupation period. The hospital ships go in, backing up a bit, liberating our own POWs was an absolutely stunning experience. I talked about the story of the USS Houston, the subject of my second book. That was where Admiral Halsey first figured out, oh my God, there were survivors from the Houston, and here they are. They've been POWs for 3.5 years. And he rallied his medical teams to tend to the POWs at a Mori camp and all the satellite camps around Tokyo and deeper inland and Thailand and Burma, and get those guys some medicine, get them back home. But the hospital ship USS Haven moors at Dejima Pier, Nagasaki, in September of '45 to see to the repatriation of US POWs, and sees that the locals have these ungodly skin conditions and injuries and wounds, and they take them in and they see that their white blood cells are all out of whack, and they've been, well, it turns out they've got, the Japanese are calling it atom bombing disease. It was gamma ray poisoning from the bomb. They had no experience of what atomic weapons do to people. We knew they produced shock and blast and heat, but there was no understanding of radiation sickness or fallout or anything like that. And it just shows you even in spite of the expertise of the Manhattan Project, these bombs were designed, conceived, and used with but the dimmest idea of what they would actually do to people. And post-war, in the Crossroads test after the war, I'm working on this, I've been working on early Cold War, we round up the old ships, put them at Bikini Harbor, and drop a couple more bombs on them just to see what happens to the ships. We have goats and rats and pigs on the decks. We put all kinds of Army stores on deck to see what happens to military uniforms hit by a Fat Man type device. And it's all a revelation. Nobody really knew. And it's just kind of incredible to look back at it now and to see, moving into the Cold War. You read the old issues of the New York Times in the 50s, and they'd have columns on atomic tourism. You can go watch atomic bombs go off in the desert. It's crazy. It's crazy. It's all just madness. It's all just crazy. And here are Hiroshima and Nagasaki now. They're our allies. We helped them rebuild these cities. We flooded money into Western Europe to uphold the integrity of European society against the Soviet communist menace. And the nature of war changed. It became political, it became subversive, became covert. And here we are. Here we are. So anyway, I just find this immensely interesting. Everything that comes together, it all comes together in the Marianas Islands. And here we are today. The Chinese call the Marianas the second island chain. They consider all the waters west of the Marianas as their own. And that's our next problem. But don't ask me to talk about that. We'll need to get some flag officers in active duty to tell you what's happening out at Spratly Islands and places like that. How much time do we have?
We have as much time as the audience would like to ask some questions.
Okay.
I'm sure they do.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, very good. Anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
On the map in the lower right-hand corner, it said something about in the event of
This one?
projected 4 divisions per month. Was that in addition, if war was needed?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, would we have to reinstate the draft? Imagine that. The point system, all of our guys went home, and what if we need more? Where are they going to come from? This was the wing and a prayer aspect of Operation Olympic and Cornet. Very good book on all this by Richard Frank. His work. He wrote a big book on Guadalcanal, and then he wrote a book called Downfall. And Rich is just he's a very rigorous historian. He knows how to assess evidence and marshal documentation, and he's pitiless about knocking down some of these shibboleths about how it was gratuitous to use the bombs, and the Japanese were ready to surrender, and they were talking to the Soviet Union, and they had, they're parlaying through Moscow to broker an end to the war. Anyway, Rich Frank's book Downfall is just tremendous, but he gets into the intelligence assessment of how many troops we were going to need to take down Japan in an invasion, and the Army didn't know, and there you have some evidence of it right there. And the event commitment exceeded forces projected. Build-up of 4 divisions per month from U.S. would begin in June of '46. I mean, what if the war lasted that long? How many fatalities are we talking about? American, Japanese, and civilians in other countries, other occupied countries, Thailand, China, anywhere Japanese soldiers were still fighting, and anyway, it's yes, sir.
Given the fact that from Tinian, we could bomb Japan pretty much at will. Why did we need the bloodbaths of Iwo Jima and Okinawa? What
Yeah.
was the strategy, and did it work?
Y'all hear the question, why were these subsequent campaigns necessary? Once we had Tinian as an air base and Saipan and Guam, why did we proceed westward? And the answer has to do, I think the best answer is we had to maintain pressure. We had to, there was a constant process of marshaling of forces and logistics, and if we didn't use, the system the machine had to continue running, otherwise the Japanese would have interpreted it as something that it was not. It might have emboldened them that we were stopping, and the idea of forcing an implacable opponent who's heavily armed and dead set on opposing you at every end. The only way to vanquish them, the military leaders thought, and I'm sure Truman and President Roosevelt would have agreed, was that you had to maintain pressure. You had to give them no chance. You had to remove breathing room. You had to take away lifeblood. You had to keep the pressure on at every moment. And so the pace of all these operations was something they constantly talked about. There were any number of unnecessary campaigns. Peleliu stands out notably to me. Admiral Halsey said, he said, we can go into, he said, I've neutralized Peleliu by carrier air attack. We don't need that damn island. We can take the Philippines without taking Peleliu. The original rationale was Peleliu would support the jump into the Philippines. Halsey said, I don't need it. Admiral Nimitz said, well, the shipping's been assigned. The men are, we've formed up, we've trained, so the least expensive and least complicated option is to let it flow forward. And I think that logic was in place in each of the campaigns that you mentioned. The specific rationale for Iwo Jima was to deprive the Japanese of that fighter base and to protect our B-29 pilots hitting Japan. It also provided an emergency base for our planes to land. They were battle damaged. They could land on Iwo Jima, and did. Many did. So some have figured, well, the cost of seizing Iwo Jima was the same as, was equalized by the lives saved in taking it. And it makes me sick, because when I read Saburo, there's a memoir by the Japanese fighter pilot Saburo Sakai, and he talks about how lightly defended Iwo Jima was in July, August of '44. We could have taken it with a regiment. If only we'd found a regiment to send over there and support, So the woulda, coulda, shouldas are innumerable. And when I read his account of how threadbare the defenses of Iwo Jima were in the summer of '44, such a tragedy that we had to lose 5,000 Marines from the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Division, taking that in March of '45. But we did, because it was on the schedule, and it takes a lot of planning. Yes, sir.
Can I ask you a question about Lady Gulf?
Please.
About your first book, it ties into that. I'm just curious what your thoughts are, why Admiral Halsey didn't get more blame for leaving the strait open and not leaving behind Task Force 34 with Admiral Lee.
Yeah, so Halsey's
That exposed Tacky 3.
Halsey's famous moment. My first book, The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors, was about the action of these little destroyers and destroyer escorts who were, circumstances conspired to pit them in broad daylight against the largest Japanese battleship fleet they ever sent to sea. Why did that have to happen? Part of the reason had to do with the fact that Admiral Halsey's big fleet had gone on a little joyride. He got lured out of position, and this little 7th Fleet task group was left to pay the price and perform heroically, by the way. But no, Halsey had lobbied for operational orders that gave him that flexibility, basically. He had written orders that destroying the Japanese fleet became his primary mission if such opportunity presented or could be created. So if the situation prevented, or if he could just go aggressively do something, he was authorized by his orders to do it. So that's, I hold Nimitz, I think that's on the debit side of the ledger for Nimitz, that he gave in to that pressure and allowed Halsey the freedom to kind of act rashly and to our disadvantage as he did. But why wasn't he disciplined for it? Well, because he had the defense that he had orders, and he was just following his orders. In his memoirs published after the war, he talked about how he had to go with everything after the Japanese fleet, because dividing your force was just cardinal rule number 1 in the Navy, and it's full of defensiveness about why he did what he did. The reason he wasn't disciplined for it was he was the public face of the Navy, and Nimitz is very sensitive to controversy. He knew that appropriations would suffer in Congress if there were this infighting went on, because that would kind of sap morale. And at the end of the day, Halsey was, when it came time to decide who got the last 5th promotion to 5 stars, Fleet Admiral, Halsey got it over Spruance. So that's sort of a ratification of Halsey's reputation. And you can make the case that Halsey deserved it, because earlier in the war, he was an area commander in the South Pacific when Guadalcanal could have gone either way. And so you weigh pluses and minuses with all these guys. As a writer and never having served, I don't like saying, oh, he was an idiot and he was wrong and he was right. But if you do enough reading and enough analysis, you can judge people. But I don't like to judge people outside the context of the time they were in. And I don't like to judge people on the basis of information that they didn't have or couldn't have had in the moment. And so I try to be fair to these guys. But Halsey was protected by his reputation. And as Spruance put it, Spruance was not about this public persona thing. He feared public personas of becoming an independent alter ego. Spruance put it in a letter to his wife. He said, he was kind of lamenting Halsey's public profile, and he said, when a guy gets a reputation like that, he starts acting in accordance with what people think that the reputation should do. And I think that line actually got cut from my book because I tried to move it somewhere else. And I think I cut that line intending to paste it somewhere else, and I got a phone call, and I never pasted it. I'm sick. I went looking for it. Where's Spruance's line about Halsey's alter ego? It's not in the book. So,
One more question.
yeah. Ma'am, how about you? Yeah.
All right. When you mentioned this, your Japanese government teaching the people in the island that is the U.S. Marine is evil and rape and everything. That reminds me, because I'm Vietnamese and the North Communists, they do same tactic with their people. They say it's a U.S. It's have a tail.
They have a tail.
And they evil and they drink blood and they eat the liver. So all the North Vietnamese people really hate U.S. at that time and they fight for it.
Right.
And so I'm just wondering, when you're talking about the island, Saipan, when you wrote the book, did you ever visit those people in that island?
No, I did not. In fact, the part of the issue is, like, when you go places today, they've changed so fundamentally. My challenge is to see the places as they were 70 years ago. And one technique I use to do that is I do a great deal of photo research in the early stages of my research so that I can get a visual sense of, and I also look to oral histories and other sources, so I hear the voices of the people in the moment. Because I feel like memories, some historians don't like oral histories that are taken many years later because memory changes. Places certainly change. If you go look at these islands today, they're modernized, they have hotels, and it's hard to picture the original primitive nature of a battlefield when there's a Hyatt hotel with a spa, on this beach that was the site of this. So no, I haven't done that, partly out of inconvenience, but I think there's also a defense of not traveling too much because you can get misapprehensions. When very good impressions are available in the photo archives, you go to National Archives in the still pictures branch, and they also have motion picture branch, you can really get a very strong sense of a time and a place through the images that you'll find. And so, some authors will gather their photos and put them in the book late in the process as an afterthought. And to me, photo research is part of the primary research effort on these books, in the challenge of going back, projecting my imagination into a place and time. So,
I think hitting it on the wonderful words you just said about the National Archives is a perfect. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, I would like to present my good friend here, Jim, with a little token of our appreciation for doing this today. This is a set of our 4 pen sets where he can sign some more of, and hopefully do some more signing on some more books in the future.
Thank you very much.
And on behalf of the foundation, this was a book to put together CVN 78, President Ford's aircraft carrier for the commission event. So thanks for coming.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna leave all this here so that I remember to retrieve it.